Sarah Williams, 70 years old, walks into the hospital lobby with quiet dignity, but the receptionist barely notices. "Excuse me," Sarah says, trying to get her attention. The receptionist doesn't even look up, waving her off with a hand. "Just take a seat. We'll get to you when we can." Sarah's eyes narrow. She's used to being underestimated, but not today. Not here. "Excuse me," she repeats, stepping forward. "I need to check in." Without a second glance, the receptionist huffs. "Look, lady, we're busy. You're gonna have to wait. Sit down or leave, your choice." That's it. Sarah's calm demeanor cracks. With a sharp breath, she snaps. "You don't get to talk to me like that." The receptionist smirks clearly, thinking she's dealing with just another frail old woman. But Sarah isn't done. She takes a step forward, her voice cold and steady. "I built this hospital, I own this hospital, and you're about to learn who the hell I am." The receptionist freezes. The room goes quiet. The other patients stare in shock, trying to process what just happened. The receptionist stumbles over her words. "What did you just say?" I said. Sarah steps closer, her voice icy with authority. "I'm the founder of this hospital, and you better get your manager." Now the receptionist's face pales. The smirk wiped clean off her face as she scrambles to call for help. Sarah stands, tall eyes never leaving the receptionist. Her message clear. No one disrespects her. Not anymore. The tension in the room was palpable. The receptionist, now visibly shaken, had just dialed the number for the hospital manager, her fingers trembling slightly. But Sarah didn't look away. She wasn't about to let them pretend like nothing had happened. She had been silent for too long, overlooked and dismissed by people who didn't know her worth. But now they would know exactly who she was and why they should never underestimate her. A few moments passed in thick silence, punctuated only by the faint hum of the hospital's overhead lights and the occasional cough or whispered conversation from the other patients. Sarah remained standing, her back straight and her face unwavering. The receptionist continued to fumble with her phone, trying to reach the manager, but it was clear her usual confidence had evaporated. The staff around her had stopped what they were doing, eyeing Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. It was clear that none of them knew what to make of the situation. Finally, the manager, a middle-aged man with a crisp suit and a calm demeanor, emerged from the back office. He had clearly been summoned quickly, and his face showed no sign of recognition when he saw Sarah standing there, arms crossed, still waiting for a response. He approached slowly, his eyes flicking nervously between the receptionist and Sarah. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked in a neutral tone, clearly trying to assess the situation without escalating it further. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. "The problem is that your staff treated me like I was invisible, like I was a nobody. When I walked in, not a single one of them bothered to acknowledge me, let alone offer assistance." Her voice was calm, but the weight of her words carried an unmistakable edge. "I asked for help, and I was dismissed, treated with complete disrespect." The manager's gaze shifted, his attention now fully focused on Sarah. He had been expecting a simple complaint, perhaps an issue with wait times or the usual dissatisfaction that came from impatient patients. But this was different. This woman wasn't just a disgruntled patient. There was something about her that made him pause, something in the way she held herself. "I'm very sorry to hear that," he said, his tone shifting to one of politeness. "Please let me assist you right away. We'll make sure you're taken care of." But Sarah didn't back down. No, that's not enough. I've been a patient here before, and I've been treated this way before. The problem is not just the receptionist, it's the attitude that runs through this entire hospital. This place was founded on a set of principles: respect, fairness, and care for every person who walks through those doors. Yet you've allowed an atmosphere of condescension and neglect to fester, and I won't stand for it anymore. The manager's eyebrows furrowed slightly as he looked around at the others in the waiting room, sensing the quiet energy that had begun to shift. Patients were now watching intently, some of them even standing slightly to get a better view of what was unfolding. The once ordinary, almost boring hospital lobby had turned into a charged battleground of words. "We don't intend to disrespect anyone here," the manager said, but his voice lacked the firmness that Sarah was expecting. It was the kind of apology that seemed rehearsed too quick to be sincere. "We'll make sure your concerns are addressed." Sarah's eyes locked onto his, challenging him. "No, that's not good enough. Not anymore. You don't get to brush this off like every other complaint. This is about something deeper than bad service. It's about how people are treated, how they're seen." For a moment, the manager said nothing. It was as if he was measuring his next words carefully, trying to gauge how to handle a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. "I understand you're upset," he said, his voice slightly more cautious now, "but we don't have all the facts. If you could just—" Sarah cut him off, her voice steady but now full of conviction. "I'm not just upset. I'm disgusted. You think you can walk all over me because I'm old, because I'm a woman, because I'm black. But let me tell you something. I built this hospital." There was a long pause. The words hung in the air like an accusation impossible to ignore. Sarah's statement had the effect of a slap in the face, and the manager visibly stiffened. He stared at her, his eyes widening ever so slightly. He had been prepared to deal with a disgruntled patient, perhaps a frustrated mother, or an anxious family member. But this was different. This was someone who held the very foundation of the institution in her hands, someone whose influence he had clearly underestimated. "I'm the founder of this hospital." Sarah continued, her voice unwavering. "I fought to get it built, and I've fought every step of the way to make sure it serves everyone equally. But now it seems like this place has forgotten what it was meant to stand for." The receptionist, who had been standing to the side, was now wide-eyed with disbelief. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected Sarah to turn the tables so dramatically to expose herself, as someone with the power to back up every word she said. The manager, visibly uncomfortable, glanced down at his shoes for a brief moment, before finally looking back at Sarah. I'm so sorry," he stammered, now visibly flustered. I had no idea who you were." Sarah gave a tight smile. "Of course you didn't. You never bothered to look. And that's the problem. You only see people based on what's on the outside, not who they really are." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. "That's why this hospital is in trouble. You treat people like numbers, like cases to be filed away. But I didn't build this place to be a factory for cold, impersonal care. I built it for people, for human beings." The room was silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Sarah's words hung in the air like a challenge. Finally, the manager nodded his shoulders, sagging in defeat. "You're right," he said quietly. "We've clearly lost sight of what matters, and I'll do whatever I can to make it right." Sarah regarded him coolly for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I'll hold you to that." With that, she turned on her heel and walked toward the waiting area. her steps measured and deliberate. The manager remained frozen for a moment, his mind racing. He had just learned a hard lesson. Underestimate someone, and you might just find yourself on the receiving end of a lesson you never expected. The receptionist quickly scrambled to follow, her face still pale, but Sarah didn't wait for anyone to catch up. She knew exactly what she had to do, and she wasn't going to let anyone forget it. The hospital lobby fell into an eerie silence as Sarah Williams made her way toward the waiting area. She could feel the eyes of everyone on her patient's staff, even the manager who had just promised to address her concerns. But Sarah's focus wasn't on them. She had made her point, and now it was time to see if they would live up to their words. The manager, still standing at the desk, watched her with a mix of disbelief and unease. He had never encountered a situation like this before. A patient, sure, but a patient who was not only a founder of the very institution that employed him, an institution he had thought he could control. That was something entirely different. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. The old woman, no. Not just any woman, had turned the tables on him with a simple sentence, shattering his assumptions about who belonged in positions of power and who didn't. Sarah had been the silent architect of this hospital, the very cornerstone on which it was built. And yet no one had bothered to see her as anything more than just another elderly face in the crowd. But today she wasn't going to let them forget her name. She wasn't going to let them treat her like an invisible old woman. Today she was going to remind them that she had shaped this hospital, this institution, and she still had the power to demand change. As she sat down in the waiting area, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on the years that had led her here. It had been decades since she first founded the hospital, back when she had been a young, driven woman fighting against every stereotype and obstacle that stood in her way. The road had never been easy. There had been struggles, financial troubles, opposition from others who didn't believe in her vision, and moments when she had nearly given up. But Sarah was no quitter. She had fought for every inch of this hospital, for every patient who had walked through these doors, and for the dignity of those who had been cast aside by society. She had built this place from the ground up. Every brick, every wall, every policy had her fingerprints on it. Yet somehow, in the years that followed, it had lost its way. The staff had become complacent too. Comfortable in their positions, the hospital had expanded, become a beacon of medical care in the city, but with success had come a shift toward treating patients like numbers, not people. The very thing Sarah had fought against all those years ago was now happening right under her nose. She could see it in the eyes of the receptionist, the indifference in the way the staff interacted with patients. It was as if the hospital had forgotten its roots, forgotten who had brought it to life. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden approach of the manager, who had walked over with an air of urgency. His face was flushed with embarrassment, his earlier confidence now replaced with a nervous energy. "Miss Williams," he began, his voice a little too cautious. I think we need to have a serious conversation about what happened just now." Sarah didn't immediately look at him. Instead, she stared ahead, her fingers lightly tapping on the armrest of the chair. "What's there to discuss?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "You've already heard everything I needed to say. It's clear that this hospital has lost its way, but maybe you don't realize how far gone it is." The manager shifted uncomfortably, stepping closer to her. He had been trained to handle disgruntled patients, to soothe angry customers, to de-escalate situations. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for the woman who had founded this very place, who was now holding him accountable for the failures that had crept in under his watch. "We're doing our best," he said, trying to sound more reassuring. "We've been working hard to improve, but I'll admit we've made mistakes. We've had some missteps. I'll make sure this gets addressed with the team. I promise you." That Sarah's eyes flicked toward him, her gaze sharp, unyielding. "Make sure it gets addressed," she repeated, her voice low but firm. "You've got it backwards. You should have been addressing this long before I had to walk in here. Today. You got no idea how many people, how many patients have been ignored, treated like they don't matter." The manager opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah cut him off again. "You think I'm just some angry old woman venting? Is that it? That's why you're standing here trying to explain yourself? Well, let me tell you something. This isn't about me. This is about every person who's been mistreated in this hospital. This is about the people who come here looking for help and leave, feeling worse than when they came in." Her voice grew louder with each word, the power of her experience ringing clear. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over him. "You want to fix this? Start by looking at who you've been hiring. Start by looking at the attitudes of the people who work here. Start by remembering that this hospital was built on empathy, not efficiency, on respect, not profits." For the first time, the manager seemed to falter. His posture shifted, and his expression softened, a flicker of realization crossing his face. "I understand. I truly do. But what do you want me to do? We've got policies, procedures, changes take time." Sarah shook her head slowly, her lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. "Time? You think time's the problem here?" She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his. "No. The problem is that you've been giving people time to forget their values. You've been letting them get away with doing the bare minimum. You've been letting them think they can get by without truly caring for the people who walk through those doors. And I'm telling you right now, I won't stand for it anymore." The manager opened his mouth to speak again, but Sarah held up a hand. "I didn't come here for an apology. I didn't come here to hear how sorry you are. I came here because you needed to hear the truth. You needed to understand that this hospital is not just a building. It's a legacy. It's a promise to every person who has trusted us with their health, their dignity, and right now you're failing them." She stood up, her expression hardening her voice. Resolute. "I'm going to give you a chance to fix this. But mark my words, you have a very short window. Change is needed, and it's needed now. Because I'm not going to watch this place become just another faceless corporation, not while I'm still breathing." With that, Sarah turned and began walking out of the waiting area, the room still silent behind her. She didn't need to say anything more. The message had been delivered. The ball was now in their court, and as she stepped into the hallway, she knew that this battle was far from over. She had started something today, and she wasn't going to let anyone stop it. As Sarah walked out of the waiting area, her steps measured and deliberate, the weight of the moment lingered in the air, like a storm that had just passed through. The manager, still standing at the desk, watched her retreating figure with a mix of confusion and deep regret. It was one thing to deal with an angry patient, another thing entirely to realize that the very woman who had confronted him was the driving force behind the institution he worked for. The realization had struck him like a bolt of lightning. He had dismissed. Sarah assumed she was just another patient, but now he understood just how gravely wrong he had been. The receptionist, still in shock, slowly turned her gaze from Sarah's retreating form to the manager. Her eyes were wide still, processing the bombshell that had just been dropped. She had never, in her wildest dreams, imagined that the frail-looking woman who had walked into the hospital this morning could be the founder of it all. For a moment, the lobby seemed to hold its breath, frozen in time, as though the walls themselves were waiting for what would happen next. The manager, now realizing the full extent of his mistake, quickly walked to the receptionist's side. His voice, still shaky, came out in a low whisper. "Do you have any idea who that woman is?" The receptionist, still dumbfounded, shook her head. "No. I didn't know she was the founder. I had no idea. I thought she was just some old lady I never imagined. She's Sarah Williams." The manager interrupted, his voice sharp with the realization that had just struck him. "She's the one who built this place. She's the reason this hospital exists." He paused for a moment, looking back at the empty hallway where Sarah had disappeared. "And we've just completely disrespected her." The receptionist felt her stomach drop as the magnitude of the situation sank in. But she didn't look. She didn't seem like she trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "She doesn't have to look like anything." The manager snapped, his frustration boiling over. "You see, that's the problem with this place. We've lost touch with what really matters. We've been so focused on efficiency, on profits, on running this place like a business that we've forgotten the heart of it. We've forgotten who we're here to serve." The receptionist opened her mouth to say something, but she didn't have the words. The weight of their actions was too much. She had treated Sarah with the same indifference she might show any other patient, thinking nothing of it, thinking it was just the way things were done here. But she was wrong. In the next few minutes, Sarah's words echoed through the hospital's halls, reverberating in the minds of the staff. The manager, finally understanding the gravity of what had occurred, took a deep breath and turned to the rest of the staff who had gathered nearby, overhearing the conversation. They had all witnessed the exchange. They had seen how Sarah's dignity had been dismissed so effortlessly, and now they were beginning to realize the cost of that mistake. "Everyone gather around," the manager called out. His voice was no longer polite, no longer rehearsed. It was full of urgency, full of the responsibility he had long ignored. Slowly, the staff members began to assemble, some looking uncertain, others worried about what was coming. They had no idea who Sarah Williams was. No idea that they had just treated the very founder of their institution like she didn't matter. But now, they were about to learn. "We have a situation." The manager began, his voice loud enough to capture everyone's attention. "A serious one. I need you all to listen, because this is a turning point for us." His eyes scanned the room, making sure that every person was paying attention. "That woman who just walked out of here, her name is Sarah Williams. She is the founder of this hospital. She created it from the ground up. And what just happened in here today? How we treated her, how we ignored her, dismissed her, was completely unacceptable." The room fell silent. A few exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and shame. They had been so busy with their routines, so accustomed to dealing with hundreds of patients every day, that they had failed to recognize the significance of the person standing right in front of them. They hadn't just failed to recognize Sarah Williams as their founder, they had failed to see her as a human being deserving of respect, as someone whose legacy had shaped the very building they worked in. The manager continued, his voice becoming more resolute. This hospital was built on values of respect, compassion, and equality. Those are the principles that made us what we are today, and we've lost sight of them. We've been treating people like numbers, like cases to be processed. That ends today. A murmur ran through the group as they began to absorb the full weight of the situation. The staff had been operating in autopilot mode for far too long, caught up in their daily tasks, without considering the impact of their actions. But now they were being held accountable, and the person holding them accountable wasn't just a disgruntled patient. It was the woman who had founded everything they knew. The manager took a deep breath and faced the group. "We've failed. I've failed. And I'm going to make it right. We're going to change how we operate here. We're going to remember the values that made this hospital great." He paused, looking around at his staff, making sure they understood the seriousness of the moment. "I'll be personally overseeing the training for all staff on how we treat patients from now on. This hospital will no longer be a place where people feel ignored or disrespected. We owe it to them, and we owe it to Sarah Williams." The staff stood in stunned silence. The room was heavy with the realization that their behavior had not only disrespected the founder of their hospital, but had also undermined the very foundation of the institution itself. There was no excuse for what had happened, no way to undo the damage that had been done. But the words they had just heard, the commitment to change, held the potential for something powerful. A turning point for the hospital, a chance to rebuild its reputation, and a chance to restore the values that had been forgotten. As the manager wrapped up the meeting, the staff slowly dispersed, each person deep in thought. The heavy air of the lobby had shifted. What had started as a routine day at the hospital had transformed into something more significant. It was no longer just about one woman's experience. It was about the values of an entire institution, values that had been put to the test and found wanting. In the quiet that followed, the hospital began to feel different. The promise of change hung in the air, palpable and urgent. And as Sarah Williams walked out of the building, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had delivered her message, and she had no doubt that her hospital, was about to undergo the transformation it so desperately needed. In the days that followed Sarah Williams's confrontation, the hospital experienced a subtle but undeniable shift. The atmosphere had changed. The staff had been put on notice, and the impact of her words reverberated through every corner of the institution. It wasn't just the staff that had been affected. It was the entire foundation of the hospital, and everyone knew it. The power of Sarah's presence, the force of her legacy, had made it clear that things could no longer continue as they were. The manager, still reeling from the shock of the previous days, wasted no time in addressing the staff. He had made a promise to Sarah, and he intended to keep it. Over the next few days, meetings were held, training sessions were scheduled, and a renewed sense of urgency filled the hospital's halls. The mission was clear. They had to reclaim the hospital's original values. Respect, compassion, and equality needed to become more than just words on a plaque. They needed to become the guiding principles of every decision, every interaction. It started with the staff. The manager called a series of meetings with all departments, emphasizing the importance of treating every patient with dignity and respect. The words "we are a family" were repeated over and over again, a reminder that the hospital was built on the belief that people mattered. It wasn't just about getting patients in and out. It was about ensuring that every single person felt valued from the moment they walked in the door. This message was reinforced not only through words, but through actions. Changes were implemented immediately. New training focused on empathy, proper communication, and the importance of understanding patients' needs. But the real challenge lay in the long-standing culture that had developed within the hospital. The managers knew it wasn't enough to simply change policies on paper. The culture had to evolve, and evolution, especially one rooted in respect and compassion, couldn't happen overnight. It was a process, a slow, deliberate process requiring patience, introspection, and most importantly, accountability. There were some staff members who resisted the changes, grumbling about the additional training and the increased scrutiny of their work. They had grown comfortable with the old ways, where efficiency sometimes meant sacrificing empathy. But the manager was firm in his resolve. No one was exempt from the new standard. If they were going to restore the integrity of the hospital, no one could afford to remain indifferent to the values that had been so carelessly pushed aside. As the weeks passed, the transformation began to take hold. Staff members started to engage more meaningfully with patients. There were fewer rushed conversations, fewer cold interactions. Nurses, doctors, and even receptionists began to listen with intention, making an effort to connect with those who were often overlooked. It wasn't always perfect. There were still moments of impatience, moments when old habits resurfaced, but the change was undeniable. Patients began to notice the difference. They were greeted with warmth, their questions were answered thoughtfully, and their concerns were addressed with genuine care. The cold clinical atmosphere that had once dominated the hospital began to give way to a more human, welcoming environment. Word spread quickly, and the hospital's reputation, once tarnished by neglect and impersonal service, started to improve. There was a palpable sense of pride that returned to the hospital staff, a sense that they were not just clocking in and out for a paycheck, but that they were part of something meaningful, something that was working toward a greater good. For the manager, the process was a bittersweet one. On one hand, he was proud of the changes they were making, but on the other hand, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of shame. Sarah had been right. He had allowed the hospital to drift away from its original mission. He had let the efficiency of the system overshadow the human element that had been its core. But he was determined to make it right. It wasn't long before Sarah's influence was felt in more ways than just in the hospital's practices. She became a silent force, watching from the sidelines, observing the changes taking place. She had not returned to the hospital since their confrontation, but she didn't need to. The hospital was no longer the place it had been. It had taken her words, her challenge to shake the foundation of complacency and wake the staff up to the truth that they had been ignoring for far too long. One afternoon several weeks after Sarah's visit, the manager received a phone call. The voice on the other end was familiar, and as soon as he heard it, his heart sank. It was Sarah. "How's it going?" she asked. Her tone casual, but with an underlying weight. The manager hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's going well, Sarah. We've made a lot of progress. The staff is responding. We've rolled out new training. We've changed the way we approach patient care. It's been hard work, but we're getting there." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Good," she said simply. "But don't stop there. I'm not going to pretend this is a quick fix. You've got a long way to go before this hospital fully lives up to what it was meant to be. But I'm glad to hear things are moving in the right direction." The manager could hear the quiet satisfaction in her voice, but he also sensed that she was watching closely. "We won't stop. I promise. This isn't just a phase. It's a new beginning." Sarah paused again, her voice softening. It's not just about changing the hospital, you know. It's about changing the way people think. You need to get the staff to see this as a way of life, not just something they do for a few hours a day. I understand, the manager replied, the weight of her words sinking in. Good Sarah said, because if you don't, if you fall back into old habits, you'll have lost everything I built. And with that, Sarah hung up, leaving the manager with the realization that the work was far from over. Her challenge had been clear. This wasn't a temporary fix. This was about reshaping the very culture of the hospital. It wasn't just about how they treated the patients. It was about how they treated each other, how they saw themselves and their purpose. As the manager hung up the phone, he looked around the hospital's lobby, now filled with patients, staff, and visitors. He had a renewed sense of determination. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but it was one that had been long overdue, and as long as Sarah Williams's legacy was alive within these walls, he knew they could get there. In the weeks that followed Sarah Williams's intervention, the hospital had undergone a profound shift. What had begun as a single moment of confrontation had set in motion a chain of events that not only altered the day-to-day operations, but also redefined the very culture of the institution. The staff, once caught in the momentum of routine, had been awakened to the core values that had originally fueled the hospital's creation. And while progress had been made, everyone involved knew that the road to fully restoring the hospital's legacy was far from over. Sarah's absence after her visit had left a quiet void. She had said her piece and walked out, leaving the manager and the staff to pick up the pieces. But her presence lingered, a reminder that the work was never truly finished. She had planted the seed for change, but it was up to those who remained to nurture it, to ensure it wasn't just a fleeting response to a single act of defiance. This was about ensuring that the principles of respect, empathy, and human dignity became the bedrock upon which the hospital would continue to stand for generations to come. The manager had taken the reins and, with newfound urgency, had worked tirelessly to implement the changes Sarah had demanded. The training programs that had been initiated weren't just about improving the quality of care. They were about transforming the way the staff interacted with the very essence of their work. They weren't just treating ailments. They were serving people, human beings who deserved compassion and respect, regardless of their background, age, or appearance. There were setbacks, of course. Not everyone had embraced the change with open arms. Some of the senior staff members, accustomed to the old ways of doing things, found it difficult to let go of their entrenched habits. But the manager, along with a group of passionate staff members who had fully embraced the new direction, worked to break through the resistance. They held open discussions, shared patient stories, and reminded everyone why they had chosen this line of work in the first place. Slowly but surely, the hospital began to feel like a place of healing again, not just for the body but for the spirit as well. One of the key areas of focus had been communication. The staff had been trained not just to speak to patients but to listen. Listening wasn't just about hearing words. It was about hearing concerns, fears, and the unspoken needs of the people who walked through their doors. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. The front desk became a welcoming place, no longer a cold barrier between patients and the care they sought. Receptionists were encouraged to make eye contact, to greet every patient with warmth, and to engage in conversations that made them feel seen and heard. Nurses, once rushed and curt, began taking the time to explain procedures, to comfort patients, and to genuinely connect with them in a way that felt personal and meaningful. The impact of this transformation extended beyond the staff to the patients themselves. Word quickly spread that something had changed at the hospital, and more people began coming through the doors with a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. The patients noticed the difference. They felt like they mattered, like their concerns were important. The feeling of being just another number had been replaced with the reassurance that they were individuals whose well-being mattered to the people who cared for them. But the real test came when the first major crisis hit. A flu outbreak spread rapidly across the city, and the hospital found itself overwhelmed with patients. The pressure was intense, the workload heavy, and the risk of burnout high. It would have been easy for the staff to slip back into old habits, rushing through the day, treating patients as mere cases to be processed. But this time, they didn't. They leaned into the values that Sarah had reignited within them. The new emphasis on empathy, clear communication, and personalized care became their guiding light. The nurses stayed a little longer with anxious patients holding their hands as they waited for test results. The doctors took the time to explain treatments and potential outcomes in a way that reassured patients even when the prognosis wasn't ideal. The administrative staff worked together to ensure that every patient who arrived was seen as quickly as possible, doing everything they could to manage the surge while maintaining a calm and compassionate demeanor. The crisis passed, and the hospital emerged stronger, not because of the medical expertise alone, but because of the culture of care that had taken root in every department. The staff had proven to themselves that they could adapt, that they could meet the demands of their jobs without sacrificing the very principles that Sarah had demanded they uphold. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of strain and stress, but there was a clear sense of pride in their work that hadn't been there before. Months later, Sarah received a letter from the manager, a letter that was both an apology and a thank you. In it, he acknowledged the changes that had taken place, the challenges they had faced, and the way the hospital had rediscovered its soul. "We are a different hospital now," he wrote. "We are stronger, more united, and more compassionate. And none of this would have been possible without your words, without your challenge. You have shown us the way." Sarah read the letter with a quiet satisfaction. She didn't need to be there to see the changes in action. The hospital, the place she had built with so much love and sweat, had found its way back. But she knew that it was a journey, not a destination. The work would never truly be over, but it had started with a single moment of truth. Her words, spoken with passion and conviction, had been the catalyst for a transformation that would continue long after she was gone. As Sarah put the letter down, she knew that the hospital had finally reclaimed what it had lost, and she could rest easy, knowing that its legacy, her legacy, was secure. The story of Sarah Williams is not just a lesson about respect and the value of people, but also a powerful reminder to treat everyone around us with fairness and dignity, regardless of who they are. In our daily lives, we sometimes forget that each person has their own unique story, their own contributions and achievements that we may not immediately see. Just like in Sarah's story, when we treat others with disrespect or hold biases, we not only hurt them, but also miss the opportunity to build better relationships and create a healthier, more positive environment. Whether at work or in our personal lives, we need to remember that everyone deserves to be heard, treated fairly, and respected, not because of their power or status, but because we are all human beings with inherent worth. Let's take the time to recognize and value those around us with respect and gratitude. Thank you for watching today's story. If you found this lesson valuable, don't forget to like, leave a comment, sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any exciting videos coming up. Feel free to share this story with your loved ones to spread the positive messages of respect and kindness in our daily lives. See you in the next video.